what if some of Bulgaria's oldest stone sites were already ancient when history officially began? Cities carved into living rock, sanctuaries sealed beneath earth, symbols of power placed high above the landscape. Why were they built this way? And why do their origins keep slipping beyond precise dating? If these places were purely ceremonial, why do later civilizations return to them as if inheriting something they didn't create? And if no great flood is recorded here, why do so many of Bulgaria's megastructures seem designed to survive one? Perperikon. Rising from the eastern Rhodop Mountains, where volcanic rock breaks through forested slopes and the Arda River bends quietly below, Paperacon emerges not as a single monument, but as an entire stone landscape shaped over immense spans of time, its weathered walls and carved chambers blending almost seamlessly with the bedrock itself, suggesting a place less constructed than gradually revealed. Archaeological layers indicate human presence here as early as the late Neolithic, when the hill's naturally fractured rhyolite offered both shelter and symbolic prominence. And long before masonry walls were raised, the stone was already being hollowed, smoothed, and aligned into platforms, basins, stairways, and niches, whose functions remain only partially understood. Over millennia, Thracian communities transformed the summit into a sacred acropolis, cutting a vast central hall directly into the rock, its surfaces polished by ritual use, where ancient writers later claimed an oracle of Dionysus once spoke through fire and wine, a tradition echoed by the careful placement of altars and channels carved to guide liquids across the stone. Yet even these classical associations rest atop far older foundations, visible in the deepest cuts where tool marks differ subtly from later workmanship, broader and more primitive, implying techniques and intentions not fully aligned with the architectural logic of historic temples. As the site expanded, fortifications were added during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, enclosing earlier sacred spaces rather than replacing them, preserving an unusual continuity in which religious, administrative, and residential functions overlapped within the same carved terrain. Streets were etched into the rock itself, doorways cut flush with cliff faces, and entire rooms excavated rather than built, blurring the boundary between architecture and geology. Water management features, cisterns, channels, and basins appear repeatedly across the complex, some clearly Roman in design, others more ambiguous, positioned where rainfall naturally collects, suggesting that control of water was both a practical necessity and a ritual concern from the earliest phases. The scale of excavation raises questions that archaeology answers only partially. Removing and shaping such volumes of stone would have required sustained labour and planning, yet no clear evidence of large-scale habitation exists for the earliest periods, implying that Perperikon may have functioned first as a ceremonial centre drawing seasonal populations rather than a permanent city. Geological studies reveal that the hill itself is a naturally fractured volcanic outcrop, making it unusually workable but also unstable, meaning that what survives today is likely only a fraction of what once existed, with entire sections lost to erosion, seismic activity, and deliberate dismantling. As Byzantine and later medieval builders reused the site, erecting churches and defensive walls, they often followed the lines of far older carvings, preserving alignments whose original meanings had already faded. This continuity complicates attempts to assign clear dates or purposes to specific features, especially where sacred use may have persisted uninterrupted for thousands of years, obscuring the boundary between prehistoric ritual and historic religion. Some researchers have noted astronomical orientations among certain platforms and sight lines, particularly towards solar extremes, though erosion and later modification make definitive conclusions elusive, leaving such observations suspended between careful measurement and interpretive restraint. The idea that Perperikon predates known Thracian culture is supported by radiocarbon dates from nearby habitation layers and ceramic fragments. Yet the deepest carved features remain difficult to date directly, their age inferred only by context and comparison. This uncertainty has fueled broader speculation linking the site to memories of a distant environmental upheaval, a time when rising waters or climatic shifts reshaped human settlement across southeastern Europe, preserving high places like this as refuges of continuity while lowland sites vanished. While no direct evidence ties Paperacon to any singular flood event, its long occupation, elevated position, and ritual emphasis on water have encouraged questions about whether its earliest phases emerged during a period of profound environmental instability, when stone sanctuaries offered both physical security and symbolic order. What remains clear is that Paperacon resists simple categorization. It is neither purely natural nor fully constructed, neither entirely prehistoric nor comfortably historical, but instead a cumulative imprint of human intention etched repeatedly into the same enduring rock. Each era left traces while inheriting what it could not erase, creating a palimpsest in which origins are always just beyond reach. And as the wind moves through its corridors and sunlight slides across its carved surfaces, the site continues to suggest that its deepest story lies not in any single civilization, but in the long human impulse to return to the same stone and carve meaning into it again and again. Beglik Tash, Megalithic complex. Set within a low forest near Bulgaria's Black Sea coast, where oak trees grow between scattered boulders and the ground slopes gently toward the ancient shoreline, the Beglik Tash megalithic complex appears less as a constructed monument than as a deliberate arrangement of what the landscape already offered. Massive stones shifted, tilted, and positioned with minimal modification, yet with evident intention. The site occupies a natural clearing, where rounded limestone blocks lie exposed, some weighing tens of tons, their surfaces shaped by erosion long before human intervention. And archaeological evidence suggests that people began organising this space during the late Bronze Age, though the stones themselves are far older. What distinguishes Beglik Tash is the precision with which select boulders were set in relation to one another, forming narrow passages, elevated platforms, and a central sacrificial stone pierced by a carefully shaped circular opening, its edges smoothed through repeated contact rather than decorative carving. Unlike later Thracian sanctuaries that incorporate masonry walls or reliefs, Beglik Tash relies almost entirely on placement and alignment, allowing light, shadow, and seasonal change to animate the site without permanent structural additions. Researchers have noted that certain stones align with solar events, particularly the sunrise at the summer solstice, when light passes through natural gaps and illuminates specific surfaces, though the extent to which these alignments were intentional remains cautiously framed within broader patterns of prehistoric observational practice. The absence of permanent habitation structures suggests that the complex functioned as a ritual gathering place rather than a settlement, visited periodically by communities who understood the stones not as raw material, but as participants in ceremony. Excavations have uncovered fragments of pottery, animal bones, and charcoal, indicating offerings and feasting. Yet these traces are sparse, reinforcing the impression that activity here was episodic and symbolic rather than continuous. The surrounding region shows evidence of long-term human presence, and the proximity to the ancient coastline may have amplified the site's significance, situating it between forest, open sky, and sea, a convergence of natural elements often associated with liminal ritual spaces. Geological analysis reveals that while many of the stones lie close to their original positions, Others were clearly moved and propped using smaller supports, demonstrating an understanding of leverage and balance sufficient to reposition immense masses without shaping them extensively. This reliance on raw stone distinguishes Beglik Tash from later monumental traditions, aligning it more closely with earlier megalithic landscapes found across Europe, where meaning was drawn from the manipulation of natural forms rather than their transformation. The site's apparent simplicity, however, masks a complex choreography of movement and perception, as participants would have navigated between stones, passed through constricted openings, and emerged into open spaces, their experience shaped as much by bodily motion as by visual symbolism. The circular opening in the central stone has been interpreted variously as a symbolic portal, a calendrical marker, or a practical feature associated with ritual acts, yet its weathered edges suggest prolonged use rather than a single ceremonial function. Over time, the forest encroached, and the stones gradually disappeared from collective memory, lacking the defensive or administrative functions that might have ensured their reuse in later periods. Unlike sites that were rebuilt, fortified, or repurposed, Beglik Tash remained largely untouched, preserving a form of ritual expression that predates monumental architecture as commonly understood. This isolation complicates precise dating, as organic materials are limited, and the stones themselves resist chronological analysis, leaving scholars reliant on contextual artifacts and comparative frameworks. The possibility that the site reflects responses to environmental rhythms rather than political authority has led some researchers to frame it within broader prehistoric strategies of stability, where ritual gatherings reinforced social cohesion amid changing coastal landscapes and shifting climates. While there is no direct evidence linking Beglik Tash to memories of catastrophic flooding or sea level rise, its placement near the ancient shore, an emphasis on elevated stone platforms, invite reflection on how prehistoric communities marked enduring points within mutable environments. The stones endure where wooden structures and lowland settlements would not, offering continuity through slow environmental change rather than sudden disaster. Beglik Tash thus occupies a quiet position within Bulgaria's deep past, not announcing itself through walls or inscriptions, but through restraint and repetition, its meaning carried by alignment, movement, and return. In the filtered light beneath the trees, the complex suggests a worldview in which permanence was achieved not by building upward or enclosing space, but by recognizing the enduring presence of stone and arranging it just enough to let the landscape itself become the monument. Belintash Rock Sanctuary. High on a flat-topped limestone plateau in the western Rhodope Mountains, where the land drops away sharply on all sides and the sky feels unusually close, the Belintash Rock Sanctuary stretches across the exposed surface of the stone itself, its features revealed only after long approach and ascent. The plateau is marked by a network of shallow basins, channels, steps, and geometric cuts carved directly into the bedrock, their edges softened by time, yet still precise enough to suggest deliberate planning rather than random erosion. Archaeological interpretation places most visible activity here in the Thracian period, when elevated rock sanctuaries served as points of contact between human communities and the broader forces they sought to observe and negotiate. Yet the absence of datable organic material leaves the earliest phases uncertain, suspended somewhere between prehistory and early antiquity. Unlike enclosed sanctuaries, Belintash offers no walls or buildings, only an open surface shaped for interaction with the elements, where rainwater collects in carved depressions and flows along channels toward the plateau's edge, transforming rainfall into a visible directed event. The careful positioning of these basins suggests that water was not merely managed but observed, possibly measured, its movement across the stone, reinforcing cycles that governed agriculture and seasonal ritual. Certain carvings align along straight axes, while others appear clustered in ways that imply repeated modification, as if successive generations return to the same points, deepening cuts and refining shapes rather than introducing entirely new forms. The plateau's commanding views extend across valleys and mountain ridges, situating the sanctuary within a broad visual field that would have emphasized its separation from everyday life below. Geological studies show that the limestone here fractures predictably, and some features likely exploit natural fissures, yet the regularity of several basins and channels exceeds what natural processes alone would produce, reinforcing the conclusion of sustained human intervention. Belintash lacks the monumental scale of carved halls or standing stones, but its complexity lies in its integration with natural processes, using the surface of the rock as both instrument and archive. No inscriptions or iconography survive to clarify its symbolic system, leaving interpretation dependent on form, placement, and comparison with other open-air sanctuaries across the Balkans. Some researchers have proposed astronomical functions, noting possible alignments with solar or lunar events, though erosion and later disturbance make precise verification difficult, encouraging restraint rather than certainty. What distinguishes Belintash is the sense of accumulated attention embedded in its surface, the impression that the rock was returned to repeatedly, not to be built upon, but to be listened to, tested, and marked incrementally. The absence of defensive structures or nearby permanent settlement suggests that the plateau was approached deliberately and temporarily, reinforcing its role as a liminal space rather than a centre of power. Over time, stories gathered around the site, including modern associations with unusual phenomena. Yet these later narratives reveal more about contemporary attempts to fill interpretive gaps than about the sanctuary's original purpose. From an archaeological perspective, the site's endurance lies in its subtlety, its ability to persist without attracting extensive reuse or reconstruction. In regions where lowland sites were subject to flooding, erosion, or agricultural transformation, elevated rock platforms like Belintash would have remained relatively stable, preserving traces of ritual behaviour long after surrounding landscapes changed. While no evidence ties the sanctuary to a specific environmental catastrophe, its emphasis on water flow, elevation, and exposure suggests an awareness of forces that exceeded human control, negotiated through observation rather than enclosure. The plateau does not dominate the landscape through mass or height, but through clarity, offering a surface where sky, stone, and water intersect in measurable ways. Standing alone above the valleys, Belintash resists definitive explanation, its carvings forming a quiet record of engagement with time and natural rhythm, hinting that for those who shaped it, endurance was found not in walls or monuments, but in the careful marking of a place that would remain when so much else had passed away. Tatul Thracian Sanctuary. Carved into a solitary rocky hill, rising above the surrounding valley, the Tatul Thracian Sanctuary presents itself as a deliberate shaping of an already prominent natural form, its stepped profile and smoothed surfaces visible from a distance long before individual features become clear. The hill is composed of volcanic tuff, a relatively soft stone that lends itself to carving, and archaeological evidence indicates that human activity here began in the late Bronze Age, intensifying through the Thracian period as the site evolved into a complex ceremonial centre. At its core lies a rock-cut, pyramid-like structure, its flattened summit encircled by shallow channels and niches, suggesting a focus on ritual activity conducted in the open, exposed to sky and weather. Below this summit, a series of carved terraces, stairways, and chambers descend the slope, creating a vertical sequence that guides movement upward rather than inward, reinforcing the sense of ascent as a symbolic act. Excavations have revealed traces of fire use, ceramic fragments, and animal remains, pointing to repeated ceremonial gatherings rather than permanent occupation, while the absence of domestic structures underscores the site's separation from everyday life. One of Tatul's most distinctive features is a rock-cut tomb carved directly into the hill, positioned beneath the summit platform, leading some researchers to propose that the sanctuary was associated with hero cults or ruler veneration, where burial and ritual were interwoven rather than segregated. Classical sources describing Thracian beliefs emphasize the permeability between the worlds of the living and the dead. And Tatul's architecture appears to embody this concept spatially, with ritual spaces layered above a chamber, carved to receive the dead. Over time, additional modifications were made, including fortification elements during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Yet these later interventions adapt to the original carved form rather than replacing it, preserving the sanctuary's essential structure. Geological analysis shows that many surfaces were deliberately smoothed, their edges rounded through sustained use, suggesting that the hill was not simply carved once, but maintained and refined across generations. The site's elevated position offers wide views of surrounding routes and valleys, situating it within networks of movement and visibility that would have enhanced its ceremonial significance. Unlike enclosed temples, Tatul remains exposed, its ritual architecture inseparable from the landscape, reinforcing a worldview in which sacred space was defined by place rather than structure. The lack of inscriptions or explicit iconography leaves its precise functions open to interpretation, though the repetition of niches and channels suggests offerings, libations, and possibly astronomical observation tied to seasonal cycles. Some scholars have noted that the sanctuary's form predates the introduction of monumental stone architecture in the region, aligning it with earlier traditions of shaping natural outcrops rather than constructing freestanding buildings. This continuity complicates chronological boundaries, as later cultures inherited a form already charged with meaning, adapting it to their own rituals without erasing its earlier identity. In landscapes subject to erosion, deforestation, and shifting settlement patterns, such elevated sanctuaries would have remained stable reference points, preserving continuity amid change. While there is no evidence linking Tatul directly to memories of floods or large-scale environmental disruption, its emphasis on height, permanence, and the integration of burial within ritual space suggests an enduring concern with stability and renewal. The sanctuary does not present itself as a monument to a single moment or figure, but as a cumulative expression of belief shaped over centuries, its stone surfaces bearing the quiet imprint of repeated return. As light moves across its carved steps, and the valley below changes with season and time, Tatul continues to occupy its hilltop with an air of restraint, offering no declarations, only the persistent suggestion that meaning was once drawn here from elevation, endurance, and the careful shaping of stone that outlasted those who carved it. Pliska. Ancient city ruins. Spread across the flat plains of northeastern Bulgaria, where the land opens wide and the horizon stretches without obstruction, the ruins of Pliska unfold, not as a single monument, but as an immense, carefully ordered expanse, its scale only fully apparent when traced across the ground. Founded in the late 7th century as the first capital of the Bulgarian state, Pliska initially took form as an earthen and wooden settlement enclosed by vast defensive works, reflecting steppe traditions adapted to a new and unfamiliar landscape. The earliest phase consisted of an enormous outer enclosure defined by ditches and embankments that encircled an area far larger than most contemporary cities, suggesting that Pliska functioned not only as an urban centre but as a symbolic domain, capable of absorbing population herds and resources during times of instability. Within this enclosure, later stone walls were constructed, forming an inner city whose geometry reveals increasing administrative order and permanence. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual transition from timber structures to monumental stone architecture, culminating in the construction of palaces, administrative buildings, and religious complexes that signaled a decisive shift from mobile power to rooted authority. The most prominent of these later structures, the Great Basilica, stands as one of the largest early medieval churches in Europe. Its foundations laid deliberately over earlier buildings, marking both a religious and political transformation following the Christianization of the Bulgarian state. Yet beneath these visible remains lie traces of earlier occupation, including reused stone blocks and altered ground surfaces that hint at pre-existing activity on the site before its formal designation as a capital. The choice of Pliska's location, distant from mountains and built on open plain, has long puzzled researchers as it lacks the natural defences typical of earlier Thracian strongholds, relying instead on scale, planning, and artificial fortification. This openness may reflect confidence in centralised control, but it also suggests a response to environmental and social conditions in which space itself was a resource, allowing visibility, movement, and rapid assembly. The city's water management systems, including wells and channels, indicate an acute awareness of the challenges posed by seasonal variation in an exposed landscape, reinforcing the importance of infrastructure in sustaining permanence. Over time, Pliska was partially dismantled, its stones reused in later constructions, while the capital shifted elsewhere, leaving behind a grid of foundations and roads that slowly merged back into the fields. Unlike elevated sanctuaries or buried tombs, Pliska's ruins remained vulnerable to erosion, agriculture, and neglect, their survival dependent less on concealment than on sheer extent. Some researchers have noted that the city's earliest earthworks bear resemblance to defensive systems found far to the north and east, while others emphasize continuity with local building practices, illustrating the hybrid nature of its origins. Speculation about whether the site replaced an earlier settlement remains unresolved, as the flat terrain offers few stratigraphic anchors, and organic materials decay quickly in the soil. In a broader sense, Pliska represents a different response to time and uncertainty than the stone sanctuaries and tombs that preceded it, prioritizing administrative reach and political visibility over ritual permanence. Yet even here, continuity asserts itself, as new structures were layered over old ones rather than placed elsewhere, binding successive phases to the same ground. While no credible evidence places Pliska before known historical frameworks or associates it with prehistoric catastrophe, its massive scale and sudden emergence have encouraged reflection on how societies reorganize space after periods of disruption. The city's rise marks a turning point where memory, authority, and belief were no longer embedded primarily in carved rock or hidden chambers, but in ordered space and visible power. Today, the scattered remains of walls and foundations offer little immediate spectacle, yet taken together they form a quiet counterpoint to the earlier sites, suggesting that the impulse to endure can express itself as much through organisation and repetition as through stone and elevation. Pliska does not whisper of lost ages beneath the earth or on the mountain top, but of a moment when permanence was sought across open land, and when the past, rather than being buried or carved into rock, was absorbed into the groundwork of a new state, leaving behind a landscape where absence itself becomes the final trace of continuity. Sveshtari Tomb. Hidden beneath a low earthen mound in the rolling landscape of northeastern Bulgaria, the Svveshtari Tomb reveals itself only gradually, its carefully cut stone chambers concealed for centuries by soil and vegetation, preserving an interior that feels suspended between the living world and something deliberately removed from it. Discovered in the late 20th century, the tomb is dated to the early Hellenistic period and is generally attributed to the Getae, a Thracian people whose elite burial practices blended local traditions with influences absorbed through contact with the Greek world. Unlike many Thracian tombs that emphasize painted decoration or monumental corridors, Sveshtari's power lies in its architectural restraint and the uncanny presence of its sculpted figures. 10 female forms carved in high relief, half human and half vegetal, standing with raised arms as if supporting the weight of the chamber itself. Their bodies emerge seamlessly from the stone walls, merging anatomy with architectural function, blurring distinctions between structure, symbol, and ritual purpose. Above them, a carved frieze of horsemen advances toward a central figure, a procession frozen in stone that suggests continuity beyond death rather than a single moment of burial. The chamber's proportions are precise, its geometry deliberate, with carefully fitted limestone blocks, forming a space that feels both intimate and formal, engineered to endure while remaining hidden from the surface world. Archaeological evidence indicates that the tomb was used for a high-ranking individual, possibly a ruler, and then deliberately sealed, its entrance concealed beneath the mound in a way that discouraged reopening, as if permanence itself were part of the funerary intent. Yet the mound into which the tomb was cut had already been a sacred place long before this burial, part of a larger necropolis whose origins extend into earlier Thracian ritual practices tied to ancestor worship and landscape veneration. This reuse of a pre-existing sacred terrain mirrors patterns seen across the region, where later elites anchored their authority within places already charged with memory. The caryatid-like figures, often compared to Greek architectural forms, differ in crucial ways. They wear garments unique to Thracian iconography, their faces stylized rather than idealized, and their transformation into plant forms at the waist suggests a symbolic link between human life, the earth, and cyclical renewal. The absence of extensive grave goods, many of which were likely removed in antiquity, places greater emphasis on the space itself as the primary ritual instrument, designed to guide perception and belief rather than to display wealth. Structural analysis shows that the tomb's construction required advanced planning, including precise load distribution and stone carving techniques, indicating access to specialized knowledge and skilled labor. Yet this sophistication exists alongside symbolic elements that resist full explanation, particularly the choice to depict figures that appear both alive and immobile, engaged in eternal support of the chamber above. Some scholars have suggested that the tomb represents a mythic dwelling for the deceased, a threshold space rather than a final resting place, while others view it as a symbolic reproduction of a cosmic order, with the central axis of the chamber aligning the ruler's body within a structured universe. The mound itself, rising gently above the plain, recalls far older burial traditions stretching back into prehistory, when earth and stone were combined to mark transitions between worlds. In this context, Sveshtari does not appear as an isolated innovation, but as a refinement of concepts long embedded in the landscape. Geological studies indicate that the limestone used was sourced locally, reinforcing the idea that the tomb was intended to remain inseparable from its setting, bound to the land rather than transported from elsewhere. The preservation of the interior, protected by the mound and stable soil conditions, has allowed modern observers to encounter the space much as it was left, intensifying the impression that its creators anticipated a distant future gaze, even as they sought to seal it from intrusion. Speculation has occasionally extended beyond its accepted date, questioning whether certain symbolic features preserve echoes of much older beliefs, possibly rooted in times when burial mounds served as communal markers of survival through environmental change. While no evidence places the Sveshtari tomb before known Thracian culture, its deliberate concealment, structural permanence, and emphasis on cyclical imagery invite reflection on how societies respond to instability by anchoring meaning in stone beneath the earth. The tomb does not proclaim catastrophe or renewal directly, yet its silence, maintained over centuries, suggests an awareness of time measured not in generations but in deep continuity. Emerging only when modern excavation cut back the soil, Sveshtari stands as a reminder that some of the most carefully constructed expressions of power and belief were never meant to be seen again, preserved not for memory but for endurance, waiting within the ground as the world above changed beyond recognition. Mezek, Thracian Tomb. At the edge of the Sakar Mountains, where the terrain softens into rolling hills and the movement of people and goods once followed predictable routes toward the Aegean, the Mezek Thracian Tomb lies concealed beneath a substantial earthen mound, its presence betrayed only by a stone-lined passage leading inward from the slope. Constructed in the late 4th century BCE, the tomb reflects a moment when Thracian elites adopted and adapted architectural forms circulating through the Hellenistic world, yet did so in a way that preserved older regional concepts of burial and commemoration. The entrance corridor, built of large, carefully fitted stone blocks, draws the visitor gradually underground, transitioning from open landscape to enclosed space in a controlled sequence that heightens the sense of separation from the living world. Beyond it, a series of chambers unfolds, each defined by corbelled stone roofs that distribute weight without the use of true arches, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of load and stability. The circular burial chamber at the tomb's core is monumental in scale, its smooth stone walls enclosing a space that feels both protective and final, designed to endure long after surface markers faded. Excavations uncovered evidence of a richly furnished burial, including weapons, vessels, and luxury goods, many of which were removed in antiquity, leaving the architecture itself as the primary surviving expression of intent. The mound above, composed of layered earth and stone, served not only as a marker but as a protective shell, stabilizing the chambers below and sealing the interior environment. Archaeological context suggests that the tomb was associated with a powerful local ruler or noble family, positioned deliberately near routes of communication, rather than within a densely populated settlement, reinforcing its role as a territorial and symbolic anchor. The careful construction indicates access to skilled labour and organised resources, yet the tomb does not overwhelm its surroundings. Instead, it integrates quietly into the landscape, its visibility diminishing with distance. Structural analysis shows that the builders selected stone types with durability in mind, minimizing water infiltration and collapse, an approach that reflects long-standing regional experience with burial construction. Beneath the technical precision lies a symbolic language that remains only partially legible, particularly in the choice to emphasize circular space and subterranean depth, forms often associated with cyclical time and continuity. The tomb's placement within a broader tradition of mound burials links it to practices extending deep into prehistory, when earth and stone were combined to mark lineage and memory across generations. Unlike open-air sanctuaries, Mezek directs attention inward and downward, suggesting a ritual focus on containment and preservation rather than observation or alignment with the sky. Over centuries, the mound endured agricultural change, political shifts, and the reconfiguration of settlement patterns. Its survival owed less to visibility than to its integration with the terrain. While no evidence places the tomb outside its established historical period, its architectural lineage draws upon techniques and symbolic concepts far older than the Hellenistic era, reflecting a continuity of funerary thinking rather than a sudden innovation. In regions where surface structures were repeatedly rebuilt or erased, such subterranean monuments offered a more stable means of memory, insulated from many forces that reshaped the landscape above. The idea that burial mounds functioned as repositories of continuity during times of uncertainty has been raised cautiously, though the archaeological record favours gradual cultural evolution over abrupt rupture. Standing quietly beneath its mound, the Mezek tomb does not speak of catastrophe or loss, but of control, permanence, and the deliberate shaping of space to resist time. Its stone chambers remain intact long after the identities of those interred have faded, preserving a form of intention that transcends individual memory, suggesting that for its builders, endurance itself was the message, carried not upward into the skyline, but downward into the earth. Madara Rider. Carved high into a sheer limestone cliff overlooking the Madara Plateau, the Madara Rider appears suddenly, emerging from the rock face with a quiet authority that feels both deliberate and strangely detached from its surroundings, as if the image were meant to be seen from afar rather than approached. The relief depicts a mounted horseman in motion, spear lowered toward a lion beneath the horse's hooves, while a dog runs behind, all rendered at a scale and height that immediately separates it from typical commemorative carvings of the ancient world. Unlike freestanding monuments, the rider was cut directly into the vertical cliff, some 23 metres above ground, requiring scaffolding, planning, and a level of coordination that suggests an organised authority capable of commanding both labour and symbolic vision. Most scholars date the relief to the early medieval period, associating it with the First Bulgarian Empire, and identifying the rider as a ruler, possibly Khan Tervel, supported by nearby Greek inscriptions added later that commemorate military victories and political events. Yet the image itself resists easy classification within known Byzantine or steppe artistic traditions, its composition blending classical naturalism with something more archaic and restrained, lacking the ornamental excess typical of imperial propaganda. The cliff into which it is carved was already a place of significance long before the relief existed, forming part of a broader sacred landscape dotted with caves, niches, and rock sanctuaries used since antiquity, suggesting that the choice of location carried inherited meaning beyond political display. Weathering patterns on the relief show that it has endured centuries of exposure, its details softened by wind and water, but the rider's posture remains unmistakable, frozen in a moment that feels symbolic rather than narrative, an image of dominance, order, and continuity imposed upon the stone. The absence of any architectural framework around the relief further deepens the mystery, as it stands alone, unsupported by temples, plazas, or inscriptions contemporary with its creation, implying that the image itself was the focal point, not part of a larger constructed complex. Some researchers have noted that the cliff face bears traces of earlier carvings, or modifications now eroded beyond recognition, raising the possibility that the rider occupies a surface already shaped or revered in earlier periods, its placement perhaps intentionally overwriting or inheriting a far older sacred marker. The surrounding plateau reveals evidence of Thracian presence, Roman roads, and early medieval settlements, creating a layered cultural context in which symbols were reused and reinterpreted rather than erased. This continuity complicates efforts to view the Madara Rider purely as a medieval political statement, as its elevated position and isolation align more closely with prehistoric rock art traditions, where images were placed beyond reach, visible yet inaccessible, reinforcing their authority through distance. Geological studies show that the limestone cliff naturally fractures in horizontal bands, which may have guided the placement of the carving, but also means that significant portions of the original relief could have been lost over time, subtly altering its appearance and proportions. The rider's orientation has been examined for potential astronomical or landscape alignments, though conclusions remain tentative, constrained by erosion and the lack of contemporary records describing its intended function. The later inscriptions, carved centuries after the relief itself, suggest that subsequent rulers recognized the power of the image and sought to anchor their own legitimacy to it, transforming an already ancient symbol into a historical document. This act of reuse hints that the relief may have carried meaning even its medieval patrons did not fully understand, inheriting a site whose authority predated their own political structures. Speculation has occasionally connected the Madara Rider to much older mythic archetypes of the divine horseman found across Eurasia, symbols associated with protection, fertility, and cosmic order, though such parallels remain comparative rather than evidentiary. What is more firmly established is that the relief occupies a liminal position between epochs, carved at a moment when older sacred landscapes were being absorbed into emerging states, preserving fragments of belief within new frameworks of power. The idea that such a monument could encode memories of earlier environmental or cultural upheavals has been raised cautiously, particularly given the broader regional narratives of lost lowland settlements and shifting populations following. Climatic instability in late antiquity and earlier prehistory. While no direct link ties the Madara Rider to any flood tradition or cataclysmic event, its commanding height, endurance and placement within a long-used sacred terrain invite reflection on why certain images were elevated above time while others vanished. The rider does not explain itself, it observes, fixed in stone, as centuries passed beneath it, empires rising and dissolving across the plateau below. In this stillness lies its enduring power, not as a definitive statement of origin or identity, but as a marker of continuity imposed upon a landscape already heavy with memory, suggesting that whatever moment gave rise to the Madara Rider, it was shaped as much by what had been forgotten as by what was remembered.